Welcome to Mrs. Woodward is Absent Wednesday. Today you need to learn about different forms of logic for our rationalism unit. And to start with, we're going to start with inductive logic. Inductive logic is a form of logic similar to what Copernicus would have used. So Copernicus didn't just say, hey, I think the earth revolves around the sun. No. First, he looked up at the sky for a really long time and studied the planets and studied the sun and saw how everything moved. And based on that, he thought that, something must be wrong. The earth can't be the center of everything because look at how the sky moves around. So based on all his evidence, he made a conclusion that the earth must revolve around the sun. So inductive reasoning is all about having reasons or examples, a bunch of examples based on what you see. And based on everything that you see, you make a final inference, which becomes your conclusion or claim. So you start out wide, like, I wonder why, and you have really wide claims. And suddenly, as time passes, you narrow and narrow and narrow and narrow your conclusions until you have a very finite claim. So Copernicus at first went, I don't think this whole Earth-centric thing is right, but I don't quite know what it is. And then he looked at the sky and he said, I don't know that we're revolving around the sun. I don't think the sun is revolving around us. But then he had to come up with what was happening. So with observation, you can finally come to your conclusion. In your writing, you do this when you give your examples first, and then you make your claim at the end of the paragraph or the end of the essay. Another form of logic is deductive logic. This is most often used in the scientific method, where first you make your claim. So Copernicus would have said, I think the Earth revolves around the sun, and he'd have no evidence or basis for it yet, but it was a hunch, it was a guess, it was a thought. And then he'd come up with all of his reasons why, and if he had enough reasons, he can conclude, yeah, my conclusion is right. Or in the scientific method, sometimes when you're in science class, you have a hypothesis, and you think that that oxygen isn't really needed for your plant to survive. So that's your hypothesis or your claim. It's an opinion statement. And then you do some experiments, meaning you give some examples of what happens, and then in the end you make a conclusion. You either conclude that your claim was true or that your claim was false. In writing, you generally try to have a correct claim. It's your opinion, so it's based on something you've read usually. And then you give evidence in order to support that claim, and in the end you conclude by saying why you think you were right. So this is the more scientific or deductive way of thinking. Most of us, for English class, will be writing in this format as it's more academic. So those you may have been familiar with already, but today you're going to learn about a more complex form of logic, one that you'll often see in college. The first is the syllogism. The syllogism is an Aristotelian form of logic that makes argument and persuasion as factual as possible. So the syllogism, make sure you're taking notes on this, is if A equals B and C equals A, therefore C must equal B. You've seen this in math class before. You probably see it all the time. But we also use this in the English language, and I'll show you how in just a minute. If you can make your argument add up just like it does in math class, then you know your argument is sound. Syllogistic reasoning is probably the most factual reasoning, but it's also the hardest because of that, because often in English we don't deal in facts so much as we do in reasonable claims, things that most people would believe, not always fact. So here's an example of a syllogism. Major premise is always the A-B term. The major premise is all mammals are warm-blooded. Mammals is your A term, warm-blooded is your B term. Just like in the original syllogism how if A equals B. So all mammals are warm-blooded. But now, your minor premise, you have to give an example of this being true in real life. So a syllogism is always based on a real-life example of the major premise being true. All black dogs are mammals. So all mammals are warm-blooded, and then all black dogs, which is a mammal, are mammals. So now, if A equals B and C equals A, then C must equal B. So conclusion, all black dogs are warm-blooded. True? Yes. All black dogs are warm-blooded, and all black dogs are mammals. Everything's adding up here. It's factual. It's really hard to disprove. So this is an argument that you would win. If you stated your essay or your argument in this format, you win that argument most of the time. And on top of that, if you see someone arguing this way, you're going to have a hard time arguing against them. But the English language, like Lederer said, it's crazy. We can't always deal in argument like in math class. We usually reason a little more loosely. And this is where you get another kind of syllogism. You could either call it a loose syllogism, or the more accurate term, which you do need to know, is the enthymeme. The enthymeme, E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E, is also called Toulmin logic. Enthymeme is the Greek term. Toulmin, who taught at Stanford until just recently, he died just a few years ago, is the person who repopularized it. So in this case, A equals B still, but you always repeat your A term in the minor premise with A equals C. So you make a claim, A equals B, and then you say because. Because in the English language, a lot of times you can't always think of an example if you're arguing with someone. You just say, well, I know this is true because. You don't try to say, well, let me think of an example where that's been true. It's just not how our language works. So instead, we say, here's my claim, here's why I know it's true, because. And it's called the data. Your data is what backs your claim. So if A equals B and A equals C, then still C equals B or B equals C. This is called your warrant in English. And your warrant is the societal belief of why it's true. So when I just say, well, because it's this, it's not very factual. So if you're going to believe me, you have to share in my same societal belief of truth. So we have to sort of share the same values and experiences if you're just going to believe me based on a because statement. But this is how we argue usually. We argue based on societal warrants. So again, in English, we're going to focus on the enthymeme, which is claim, your idea, whether you're writing or thinking or speaking, your data, which is your evidence, and finally the warrant, the idea that you know your audience, you know who you're talking to, and you know that they're going to accept your reasoning. So there's my two people accepting each other's ideas. They live in the same society. So here's an example of an enthymeme based on why I'm out today. Matthew, my A term. And can you check this for me? Matthew. Matthew is sick. That's why I'm out today. My A term is Matthew. My B term is he is sick. So that is my claim. Matthew is sick. Matthew is sick because, I'm going to repeat my A term, Matthew feels warm. So Matthew, I've repeated my A term, B term was sick, and now my new term, the C term, is feels warm. So if Matthew is sick, and because Matthew is warm, you say, oh, I'm a little warm. Someone might say to you, well, you might be sick. But this is not a syllogism, so it is not fact that because he's warm, he's sick. My husband's warning me that I've been talking for 10 minutes. Does that matter? Okay. But Matthew is sick. Still my claim. Now, I could change my data a little. Matthew is sick could become because Matthew has a cold. So the societal warrant here would be that a cold means someone is sick. Even more truthful probably than someone being warm. That's even better evidence than someone feeling warm. So our because statement here is even better than just feeling warm. So you can see that your data is really based on how well you can explain yourself and how specific you can be. Now I'm going to give you one more. Matthew still is sick because Matthew this time has a 104.4 temperature. Even more specific data. So here, when someone has a 100.4 temperature, it's societally seen to be that they're sick. Now, there is one thing with the enthymeme. The enthymeme is a little looser. It's not so factual. So sometimes people will doubt you. So someone might say, if this is my claim that Matthew is sick because he feels warm, people might say, hey, I don't totally believe that warrant. That's not how I grew up. If someone's warm, that does not mean they're sick. You and them might not share the same warrant. And therefore, you as the writer have to give backing. And backing is the extra information to back up your warrant, to prove that you are credible, that you know what you're talking about. So backing can be either the extra because statements, and it adds credibility when the listener is uncertain. It's like a 3-year-old. When you tell them the sky is blue, they ask why. And you say, because of the pigments. And they say, why? And you say, because that's how the sun reflects off them. And they say, why? So you have to have backing. You have to know the becauses over and over and over again. So my backing behind why he feels that he's sick because he feels warm is that, you know, he feels warm because he has a temperature. Because he has a temperature of 100.4, he's sick. Someone would say, well, I don't think that's sick yet. And I'd say, well, my backing for that is the majority of doctors consider that a fever in a child who's above 3 months of age. And that would probably shut them up, because now I've brought up science, and that was enough backing for them. And me and the person I'm talking to both believe in the scientific theory. So they're like, okay, yeah, I believe you now. So you have to watch out for your backing. Sometimes you need extra proof to prove your point. Another 2 terms that you want to consider when someone maybe isn't as believing your warrant is rebuttal and qualification. Rebuttal is an unless statement. So you might say, someone who feels warm is sick, rebuttal, unless they just ran a race for 3 miles. And that gives you a way out, a little rebuttal statement. Or a qualifier, similar to rebuttal, but you're going to use words like probably, sometimes, and only if. So they're sick. If you're sick when you feel warm, probably, just that word alone is a qualifier. Or sometimes, or only if you didn't just run a 3-mile race. So you can add to your enthymemes, your claims, some qualifiers and rebuttals. Times when things aren't always true. And as a writer, you always want to do this, because as a writer, things are never 100% true, because you're not in the world of science or math. And so when you're talking in English, talking about argument and persuasion, You want to show that you are level-headed, that you're thinking about the opposition. If you're really absolute and you're like, no, warm always means sick, then people aren't going to believe you. They're going to think you're an extremist. And people often don't believe extremists. They sound bizarre. So you want to show a little of each side and always make a qualifying statement, usually at the beginning of your argument, to show that you are fair-minded. So why does this matter to you? Similar to the précis, we're going to be using claim, data, warrant, or the enthymeme often in class. I'll also call it the Toulmin argument. Instead of doing a précis, at the end of each reading, you'll be required to do a claim, data, warrant. So you've read letters, English is a crazy language. Claim, data, warrant isn't too different than the précis in the sense, but it's shorter. Good for you, right? So if I did a enthymeme on English is a crazy language, my claim, my A statement would be English. B, the major premise, is a crazy language. That's his claim. Or at least part of it. We know that. Because, my data now. My data, because English, I repeat my A term always in an enthymeme, uses nonsensical, compound nouns and conjugation rules. So, English is a crazy language because of its grammar rules. So therefore, C equals B, you add those up, and nonsensical grammar rules create a crazy language. Most people would agree with this, whether you're speaking French or Chinese or Russian. When your grammar rules aren't very logical, it creates for a crazy language, one that people have a really hard time learning. That's why some languages are easier to learn than others. So most people would probably agree with that. You probably wouldn't need much backing to prove that, because people of all cultures believe that languages that are nonsensical are hard to learn. They're a little crazy. But let's also look at Edwards. With Jonathan Edwards, if we have his claim, based on what we did the other day, Jonathan Edwards would say, all people should be born again, as in born again Christian. That's my claim, all people, and my major premise should be born again. Because his data is that all people should attempt to go to heaven. Okay. So, but if we add up now his B and C terms here, you get, therefore, getting into heaven requires revival. Revival meaning to be a born-again Christian. But a lot of people don't believe this. So if you're a Puritan or a strict Christian today even, you might believe this. However, many religions don't believe this at all. So many people would not believe this argument. This is where the enthymeme comes into our form of argument, because many people doubt each other's argument. So you always have to be thinking of your audience. An audience today, if you're talking to a general public, might doubt this. So you would have to give a lot of backing. You would have to say, well, qualifier for Christians. That's probably needed. You might also need a rebuttal, unless you believe in interpreting the Bible a different way. So, when you come to things like religion, where the warrant, meaning your common societal beliefs, you and the people you're talking to, when your warrants differ, especially over things like religion, you're probably not going to convince them with your argument. So you have to be mindful of who your audience is and whether or not they share your same warrant. And if they don't, you have to get more creative about how you convince them with your data. So you're now going to read a piece by Bonnie DeMonis on the death penalty. Bonnie DeMonis, if you didn't remember, she's been in the news recently. She ran for our San Diego governor. She lost in the primaries, but she was our, what was she, hun? District attorney. She was our district attorney. Is still, I think. Yeah, she's still our district attorney in San Diego. So you're going to read a piece from her published a few years ago in Union Tribune. In class, I want you to come up with her claim, meaning her main purpose, data, meaning the main reason she has that claim, And then what warrant she has, meaning what societal value do you and her share that she's building this argument on. The do chart for her argument also. Do as much of this as you can in class and then finish it up for homework. Thank you so much for attending Mrs. Woodward's Not Here Today Wednesday. And do you have any questions? I think Matthew has one.